there. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's virtual program. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm a programming librarian here at Cary Library. Before we begin, just a few things to note. If you're having any technical issues like I was 2 seconds ago, but message me in the chat and I can try to help. Questions for this evening should be sent via the Q&A button, and this program is made possible in part by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation and is organized and hosted by Lexington Living Landscapes. This program is part of the library's ongoing partnership with the organization. So now please welcome from Lexington Living Landscapes, Charlie Wyman.
Hi, good evening and welcome. We're delighted to have you with us for this special evening. I'm Charlie Wyman with Lexington Living Landscapes, coming to you from a hotel room in downtown Portland, Maine. The hotel decor behind me might be a tip-off, but the fact that there isn't a cat trying to climb in my lap may be another tip that I'm not at home. Before I turn the floor over to Russ, let me say a few words about Lexington Living Landscapes for any of you not familiar with us. We're a local volunteer nonprofit initiative launched in 2020 to promote more sustainable landscaping practices in town. More native plants, fewer invasives, fewer chemicals, more trees. We grew out of a collaboration between the town's Sustainable Lexington Committee and 3 nonprofits, the Lexington Field and Garden Club, the Lexington Climate Action Network, and Citizens for Lexington Conservation. You can learn more about us, including how to sign up for our newsletter at our website, www.lexingtonlivinglandscapes.org. Our great thanks to Russ for joining us this evening and sharing his wisdom with us. And thank you, as always, to Matt and our friends at Cary Library for hosting this evening's program. After Russ's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session moderated by Sarah Bothwell-Allen, another member of our Living Landscapes team. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. If you don't get enough of Russ this evening, this is your lucky year. You've got 2 other opportunities to learn from Russ here in Lexington in the next few months. On March 13th at 6:30 at Fallen Church, the Lexington Field and Garden Club is hosting a talk by Russ that is a great companion to this evening, when he'll focus on edible non-native weeds and invasive species in our midst. And then on Wednesday, May 22nd, Russ is leading a walk at Lincoln Park on wild edibles, hosted by Citizens for Lexington Conservation. Details of both can be found on our website. Let me now introduce our speaker and get out of the way. Until his retirement in 2015, Russ Cohen's day job was serving as the Rivers Advocate for the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game's Division of Ecological Restoration. Now Russ has more time to pursue his passion for connecting to nature via his taste buds and assisting others in doing the same. Russ operates a small nursery outside of Boston, where he grows hundreds of edible native plants and collaborates with a wide variety of landowning organizations, including the Town of Lexington, to plant them in appropriate places on their properties, a modern-day Johnny Appleseed for wild edibles. Russ, thank you for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate it. So hi, everyone. I'm talking to you from your next door neighbor town of Arlington, where I live, but I love coming to Lexington because you've done a much better job preserving open space than my town has. So I'm a strong supporter, a member of many of your organizations like the Citizens for Lexington Conservation, and I commend you for your wonderful open space, for your great trail network, and so thank you. And now let's talk about some plants. But before we do that, I've got a question to ask you. And that is, let's see if I can get this guy to advance here. Okay. All right. And even before that, I have to talk about Indigenous people. This is a slide I'm sure a lot of you have seen. It's a slide that's used to talk about the fact that Lexington and Arlington and all the land around us was indigenous land for thousands of years before folks of European extraction like my ancestors showed up. And so it's important to acknowledge that, but it's especially important to make an acknowledgement because of the content of my talk tonight, which is about native plants. So these are plants that indigenous people inhabiting this region for thousands of years, they're the ones that figured out what was edible. So I'm very grateful that that information has trickled down to me through the generations. And I have had the great fortunate opportunity to return that knowledge to indigenous people here in this region. And besides knowing what to eat, there's also other really important indigenous wisdom that I think is worth following today, including what's in this book. If you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass yet, I can't recommend it more highly. It's one of my all-time favorite books. And in this book, if I were to point you to a particular chapter that's relevant to what we're going to talk about tonight, it's the chapter called The Honorable Harvest, which is all about foraging. And in there, there's this list that Robin has put together that I liken to, it's like a 10 commandments of foraging. And she suggests that people might even want to consider putting this in a laminated card and take it with them as they go out in the woods and consult it before they forage anything. And that would be good. And this is a very, two-eyed seeing, spiritually based protocol that she suggests here, which I think is wonderful. But even from a pure ecological perspective, it's important to use a lot of forbearance and restraint when you're gathering native plants in the wild, because these are plants that often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely on them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So I encourage people to gather plants in the wild with that in mind, to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So were this to be a live program, I'd say, is there anybody in the audience that does not know this guy? I'm sure most of you know this guy. So this guy, most of you know more than probably anybody else I can think of, is responsible for promoting the planting of native plants in people's yards. And as many of you know, Doug is an entomologist, and he made a very astute observation a number of years ago that when our cherished migratory songbirds return from their southerly habitats and they fly up here and they pair up and they build their nests and they lay the eggs, and the eggs hatch and little babies are clamoring for food, and the parents are flying around trying to find them food, what are they feeding them and where are they getting that food from? They're feeding them caterpillars, and caterpillars are like an ideal baby food because it's nice and squishy and they're high in nutrients, so very good for a young bird's digestive system and for their growth. And also, those caterpillars are on native plants. Why are they not on the native plants? It's because since plants can't move, their major defense is chemical. And our native insects have figured out ways to get around, to some extent, the natural chemical defenses of the plants. Not so much that they'd eat them into oblivion, that would be counterproductive, but so they can eat and the plants can survive, and they're in a dynamic equilibrium and they're getting along okay. But there's no caterpillars in the non-native plants because our insects haven't figured out how to eat them. So if a parent bird is flying around trying to find some caterpillars to feed their babies in the nest, and there's only non-native plants there, it's like a food desert to that bird. They can't feed their babies from that. So that's the very eloquent point that Doug makes in his talk. And I know a lot of you have read his books, like this book right here, Nature's Best Hope, which Doug's opinion is all of us if we all plant natives in our yard. So as Doug is getting out there and making these very important points, lots of other folks are getting into the act. The state agencies and nonprofits are putting out these great outreach materials, printed documents, online documents, trying to educate people about native plants and where to find them and stuff like that. All right, so this image is from a slideshow that I went to about a dozen years ago, presented by a very nice woman, Kate Venturini, who's from Rhode Island. And her job at that time was to meet with the homeowners along Narragansett Bay and get them to plant native plants on their properties to help absorb the pollutants, things like, the lawn chemicals and the stuff running off the roads, and absorb them before they get into the bay and help keep the bay clean. Really important objective. So, and in her talk, she had this slide. And those of you that are gardeners and buy things from catalogs, this is a very familiar format of this slide. We have the name of the plant on the left, and then you have all these columns designated various attributes on the right, like grows tall, grows short, like sun, like shade. So I went up to Kate at the end of her talk and I said, Kate, where's your edibility column? And she said, oh, we don't tell people that. And I said, why not? And she said, we don't want people to eat these plants. We want them to leave them for the wildlife. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You've got blueberry on your list. Are you suggesting that people plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves? Oh, we wouldn't do that. Well, you might as well tell them what else is edible now. And in Rhode Island, they have an edibility column on their native species list. And here is the point of this talk. The fact that many of our native plants are edible by people too, I think provides an additional powerful incentive for people to plant them that might be insufficiently induced to do so just on the pure ecological argument. So pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for just a second. In my mind, I imagine husband, wife, married couple living on a large lot, maybe in Lexington, and the wife has heard Doug Tallamy talk, or she's read Doug Tallamy's books, and she's convinced it's really important to plant natives. She says to the husband, we got to plant natives. It's really important. And the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. And that's when she can bring him to one of my talks. Perhaps there's somebody like him in the audience tonight to learn all about the edible native plants. It's the what's in it for me angle that I think, might be enough. I realize it's not going to get everybody to rip out their lawn and put in native plants, but my feeling is it might win an additional group of people that do it that might not do it just because it's good for wildlife. And we all know or familiar with, perhaps like on your street, circumstances where both extremes exist, where you have somebody who's got a chemically addicted lawn and maybe a few topiary shrubs, and that's all they want, and they don't want any wildlife at all. They want to completely, as Michael Pollan says, it's nature under totalitarian rule to have one of these chemically addicted lawns surrounding your house. Okay, so that's one extreme. And then the other extreme are the folks that are so into natives. They're saying, oh, my wild yard is just for the wildlife now. I don't go out there. I don't do anything. I leave them all the berries. It's all for them. I don't take anything. Indigenous people would not understand drawing a line like that because they don't separate themselves from nature. They are part of nature. And the fact is that we can plant native plants in our yards, and there's plenty to go around. Wildlife can have some, we can have some, we can all share. And that's the point of tonight's talk. All right, so first thing you might want to know is, what are native plants? Which are the native plants? So really good website to check if you haven't been there yet. It's Go Botany. This is maintained by the Native Plant Trust. And there's a sheet like this one on the left for every vascular plant species that grows in New England. And here you see a map of New England with these black outlines or county boundaries. And this happens to be the page for spicebush. And you'll see that in Massachusetts, all the counties are colored in green. Well, maybe not in Nantucket, but everything else is colored in green, which means spicebush is deemed to be native in every county in Massachusetts, except possibly Nantucket. But anyway, definitely in Lexington. And there's a lot of spicebush in Lexington already, but I'll explain in my talk why you might want to plant a spicebush in your yard. And so for those folks that feel like, okay, I want to do this right, so I only want to plant native species that are deemed to be native to my county, this would be an excellent place to check. Another great place to go is if you're concerned about ecotypes, is to go for this map, which is also, this says New England Wildflower Society, the old name for the Native Plant Trust, but there's a similar map like that on the Native Plant Trust website. And so this shows you lands where plants live in communities of certain types. And some people say that not only is it important to have a species that's deemed to be native in your area, but it must be local seed grown locally, otherwise it's bad. And I've heard other botanists say that's not true at all. There's a big raging debate amongst botanists and ecologists about that. So my feeling is that one thing you could say about local ecotype plant, that if you are able to find seed of a plant that was gathered locally and propagated locally, then the chances of that plant succeeding in your yard is arguably greater than if a plant is shipped in from Minnesota or Mississippi or something like that. All right. And if you'd like to try growing plants by seed yourself, the Wild Seed Project is an excellent source of information and seed to do that. So besides having the seed of a bunch of native edible species, they also have extremely user-friendly guidelines for how to grow plants from seed. So I definitely recommend that website. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to point you to before we start getting to specific plants is another resource that's at the Native Plant Trust website, and that's called their Native Plant or Garden Plant Finder. And what this is, if you go there, you see all these boxes that you can check based on whatever conditions that you have, so you want to know what's going to work in my yard. So, if you've got a deer problem, you check the deer box. If you've got a dry site, then you check that. You want tall plants, you check that. Whatever box your conditions are, whatever plants you're seeking, you just check the box and it will spit out the things that meet your criteria. So I checked the edible box to see what would pop up. And so 80 species popped up in the Native Plant Trust database. There's actually more than 190 species that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people, but 80 is a pretty good representative example. So I clicked on sweet fern to see what would pop up, and there's the sweet fern page, and it's got more details about where it likes to grow and its native range and stuff like that. So that's an excellent resource if you want to know what is likely to do well in the conditions that I have and will do what I want in terms of tall, short, shade, sun, whatever your conditions are. All right, so with that, we're going to plunge into specific species and spend most of the rest of the talk on that. And let me apologize in advance because a lot of people that are trying to make this most friendly to the audience might organize things. Okay, here's all the tall plants. Here's all the short plants. Here's all the shade plants. Here's all the sun plants. My show isn't organized that way. I would organize it by phenology, by what's ripe when. And so we're going to start with stuff that's ripe in the spring and go through the summer into the fall. And I apologize in advance for that, but that's just how the foraging brain works. You just think about when do I need to go out and look for stuff? All right, so with that, let's start with this one. So this is obviously a fern. It's obviously the fiddlehead stage in a fern's life. That in and itself is not enough to know that this is a good fern to eat. This is actually a good fern to eat, and I'll tell you what it is in just a second. But let me tell you that a very common mistake I have heard that novice foragers make is picking fiddleheads in the spring. As they be walking along a trail in the spring, they'll see a bunch of curled up ferns like this, and they'll say, oh, fiddleheads. Boy, they look an awful lot like what I've seen for sale in the stores. They must be the same thing. So they pick them and they bring them home and they cook them up and they taste horrible. And they say, where did we go wrong? Where they went wrong is they harvested the wrong species of fern. I only know of 2 species of fern that grow in this area that taste good, and only one that's safe to eat in quantity, and that is this one. This is indeed the ostrich fern, the fiddlehead fern, the kind you see for sale in the stores and the fancy restaurants. And those ferns, by the way, that you're seeing in places like that, as far as I know, nobody is farming ostrich ferns. So if you see a fern on a produce bin or on a restaurant menu, it was gathered from the wild. And that isn't inherently bad. I gather a lot of stuff from the wild, and I think you can too. It's just the way that some people do it. So here's a great time to talk about forbearance and restraint and apply those honorable harvest principles that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in her book. So the advice I give to people gathering the ostrich ferns is to take 1 or maybe 2 of the curled up parts per clump. That's it. Let the rest grow out. And that's a totally sustainable level of harvesting. The fern could definitely take that level of picking. Unfortunately, though, what some people do that are greedy, and my guess is they're probably selling the fiddleheads, is they'll pick every single fiddlehead they see in the patch. And that saps a lot of strength in the rhizomes. You can actually kill the ferns by harvesting that hard. So just 1 or 2 ferns per clump, and that's the sustainable way of harvesting them. Okay, and this text tells you how to distinguish the ostrich fern from other things. Oh, let me go back to indigenous knowledge. Sometimes there's some really practical information embedded in indigenous knowledge. And I learned this from Nancy Turner, who's actually a botanist from ethnobotanist from the Pacific Northwest, but I learned from her that the Maliseet tribe in their traditional homeland straddles the Maine, New Brunswick border, that their word for the curled up part of an ostrich fern, masos, is the same exact word they use to describe the circling motion a dog makes before it lies down. And when I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, I see the resemblance. And That's what you get when you're, inhabiting an area for thousands of years and just paying attention to patterns and seeing similarities. So that's wonderful where there's these great pearls of wisdom embedded in indigenous language. All right, so here's the typical habitat where you're going to find ostrich ferns in the wild. So there isn't a lot of this alluvial floodplain habitat in Lexington. Lexington's kind of on the dividing line between three separate watersheds. So you need to be more in the main stem watershed. I have seen ostrich fern fiddleheads further down along the Shawshene River and the Merrimack River. And so that's where you're typically going to find it in the wild. But this is a plant that will grow in your yard. I'll get to that in just a second. So the last thing to look for the ostrich fern are these guys right here. These are the fertile fronds, the spore-bearing fronds. And when the ostrich ferns are in the spring at the curl-up stage, so way before this, there are often fertile fronds present. Not every clump is going to have them, but usually in the patch, you will see these fertile fronds. And if you cut those fertile fronds, stems and cross-section, they also form that U-shape like a celery stalk, like the fiddleheads do. All right, so if you have ever bought ostrich fern fiddleheads at the produce store and cooked them up and been not very impressed with them, you might want to try this cooking method, which is amply demonstrated to me by this naturalist, Beth Basler. Took a bunch of us to a patch of fiddleheads growing along the Connecticut River in the town of Northfield, Mass, and she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch, and we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them, and they were truly exquisite that way. All right, this photo is from Lexington. You may know where I took it. Anyway, it's just right along a public roadside. And here in somebody's yard is a patch of the ostrich fern fiddleheads. And I don't know this for sure, but I would wager that the person who planted these does not know that these are the edible ostrich fern fiddleheads. And there they are, just doing their thing. Here's another view of them. And these ostrich ferns will spread vegetatively underground if they're in a habitat that they like. And so you can see these are pretty handsome ferns. They'd be nice to have in your yard, even if you never ate them. All right, so here's marsh marigold. And this grows in Lexington, and it is a native edible species. It's one that I harvest very abstemiously, even when I do it at all. Mostly I'm just harvesting the seeds to propagate more plants. But when I've gathered this to eat, I'm gathering just 1 or 2 leaves per plant. That's it. And you need to gather them before the flowers come out, and you need to boil them at least 1 change of water to make them safe to eat. And then they taste like spinach. And you might say, I think I'll just go to the store and buy spinach. And I totally support you in that. But I'd like to include marsh marigold in my talk because this is a plant that used to be very commonly gathered and eaten by people, in the lives of some of us around today, like before the Second World War, before everybody had refrigeration, before, there was the opportunity to go to the store and buy green vegetables anytime you wanted to. People would be living off stuff put up in the root cellar and things like that. And so the spring was a time when people were really eager to start eating green things again. And sometimes it was the native plants like the ostrich ferns and the marsh marigolds provided the green vegetables before anything was happening in their gardens. So people would eat these. And what I like to do is gather the seeds, which are ripe in June, and then propagate plants from the seed, which I've done in my nursery. So there we go, marsh marigolds propagated by seed. And I have planted these out on some sites, and they're doing really well, including one site is Daisy Wilson Meadow in Lexington, right along the boardwalk. I planted some marsh marigolds, so perhaps in the spring you'll notice them there. All right, so this species, there are patches of it in the greater Boston area, but where you're really going to run into it is more in western New England, where the soil is a higher pH, because this is a plant that likes rich woods habitat. So it likes to grow in association with our cherished wildflowers like trilliums, bloodroots, Dutchman's breeches, stuff like that. So it's a species indigenous people ate extensively. In fact, 2 place names were named for this plant. So the Chicago and Winooski, Vermont are the respective indigenous tribal names for places where a lot of this plant grows. And when the colonists came, they learned this plant. They would gather some too, like when they'd be out turkey hunting, trout fishing, they'd gather some of this plant because the season for harvesting it is mainly in the spring. And that was all fine until about 20 years ago when this species began to experience a meteoric rise in popularity because all the chefs and foodies started hyperventilating about it. And they did not call it its New England name, which is wild leek. That's the traditional name it was known for hundreds of years. They started calling it by its southern Appalachian name, which is ramps. And unfortunately, what has happened since then is a bit of a gold rush mentality has kicked in on the part of some people. So they'll go in the woods and they'll look for a patch of the wild leeks like this. They'll dig up every single plant and completely wipe it out. And there are places out in the Berkshires where I used to encounter wild leeks where they're completely gone. Every plant was taken. That's obviously not a sustainable way of harvesting this plant. So here's another view of it. Another example of, the rich woods, the Dutchman's breeches that likes to grow in association with it. And anyway, another problem with digging these plants up is if you're leaving any bare soil behind, you're creating the ideal growing medium for the garlic mustard, the other invasive species, to sneak in and develop a foothold in these very sensitive rich woods habitats. So it's good not to dig them. And here's a close-up of what the plants look like. So there'll be 2 big fleshy leaves, sometimes 3, attached to a bulb, kind of like a scallion in the ground. Here's the good news. You don't have to dig up these plants to eat them. The leaves are delicious and you can leave the bulb in the ground. And so that's the advice I've been trying to get out to people that are gathering wild leeks or ramps from the wild is please consider shifting some, most, or all of your harvesting to just leaves only, and ideally just 1 leaf per plant. Leave the remaining leaf or leaves attached to the bulb, leave the bulb in the ground. That's definitely a sustainable way of harvesting the plant. And I'm going to skip this slide and just say that how do you get started with wild leeks? Well, one place you can get them is Garden in the Woods. So Garden in the Woods propagates them with these stock beds where they take these, basically a raised bed, and they cram them full of the wild leek plants, and they're able to extract a certain maximum percentage of the plants every so often, every few years. And then they'll pot these up and sell them with the other plants where they sell the native plants at Garden in the Woods. So that would be where you could get ethically propagated wild leek plants. And they also grow plants from seed. If you get your wild leeks from an Asami farm, those are likely to be seed propagated wild leek plants. So yeah, you can get your own wild leek patch established in your own yard. But if you do that, I bet you're not digging the plants up, because that would be like killing the goose that laid the golden egg. No, you'd leave the bulbs in the ground and you just harvest leaves and enjoy them, and then they'd be back again for further harvest in subsequent years. All right, so here is common milkweed, the only member of the Asclepias genus that's edible by people. And this one has an important ecological story I'll tell you in just a second. But this is a highly edible plant. Indigenous people eat this plant. And I call it a procrastinating forager's dream food because there's at least 4 edible stages to the plant, and they happen chronologically in succession. So if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage develop. So this is actually edible stage number 3, the flower buds from a tight green cluster. And I recommend the same cooking method for all milkweed parts, whatever part you're going to eat, and that is to boil it for 7 minutes. But the milkweed part you're cooking up will not shrink or get all mushy on you, even after all that boiling. So you see these milkweed flower buds in this bowl to the right here. They've been boiled for 7 minutes. Look how well they held up. If anything, they look even nicer than they did when they were attached to the plant. So you could eat these just plain as a side dish, or you could incorporate them into this dish, which is from my book called Milkweed Egg Puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole. And even the pods, when the pods are up to 1 inch long, you boil them for 7 minutes, and the texture and the flavor is very similar to green beans. All right, but here is the monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us that, yes, milkweeds are very important in the environment for the monarch butterflies to find the plants, lay the eggs on, for the caterpillars to eat them, and so on. And so it's critical that there be plenty of milkweed plants around. So this is a plant I'm actively propagating by seed, spreading around, planting at a lot of sites. And here's a very simple thing that you can do. It's probably too late now, but just remember this for this fall. So like November, when the milkweed pods are fully grown, turn brown, and split open, and the parachute business is beginning to show, you see a nice patch of them. And I've certainly seen patches, in and around Lexington where there are hundreds of milkweed plants. Gather up a pot or 2 of those seeds and carry them around with you. And if you see good milkweed habitat in a place that doesn't have any plants, like the edge of a school ball field or a bike path, something like that, just release the parachutes and help start a new colony. But what I decided to do is just walk the walk, on my own property. So here's how I did it. So there's my house in the background. I have a different car now. I still have this boat. And then we planted blueberry bushes in the edge of our driveway, and the milkweed plants, common milkweed, got established there. And we said, that's great. We'll let you stay. And so we do have to put a net over our blueberries so we share them with the birds. Without the net, I'm not sure we'd get any. It's probably about 50-50 the way it turns out. But the monarch butterfly said, hey, there's milkweed here. So they laid their eggs on the leaves. And we know that because one day we found this crystal attached to a hinge on our garage door. And fortunately, it was there because when the door went up and down, the chrysalis just rode up and down as the door went up and down. And it was like that for a couple of weeks. And then one morning we went out and the chrysalis was clear and it was empty because the butterfly had metamorphosed and flown away. So yeah, so that's how you can balance out foraging you do by planting the native plants in your own yard. All right, here's a native species called basswood. This is Tilia americana. There's also Tilia cordata, which is the little leaf linden, which is a very common street tree. They're edible the exact same way. So in terms of edibility, you don't know whether you have the native one or the introduced one from Europe. It doesn't matter. Two edible stages are in the spring when these leaves are tender and green, you can eat them raw. And then around the first day of summer is when the plants bloom and you make a tea from these flowers, and it has a wonderful flavor, lemon honey flavor. And also has a wonderful fragrance that pervades the air. And you can make tea from these flowers fresh or dried. And it has, as I say, it tastes very good. It also has two medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and your mental state at the same time. So herbalists love to recommend this plant to their clients. And this is also, these native flowers are good for pollinators. And you can actually hear a basswood tree before you see it because there's so many bees and other insects working the flowers. Their buzzing is audible before you see the tree. Okay, so here's another plant that's a early season food opportunity for pollinators, the amelanchier or the Juneberry shadbush serviceberry. And if you're looking for these in the wild, the best time to spot them is in the spring because they bloom a week or two before the crabapples do. So the blossoms really show up. And remember where that spot is and then go back in June to get the fruit. And when the fruit is ripe, it looks like this. And they look a lot like blueberries, but they don't taste really like blueberries. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds because they're all related plants. Cherries, almonds, and Juneberries are all related species in the rose family. Anyway, so it's around the first day of summer when you're going to find the ripe Juneberries, and they're great for stuffing your face right by the tree. They're very tasty. You can also make stuff with Juneberries, and my book's got a couple recipes for using Juneberries. And now these berries are very popular with songbirds too. And so you might say, oh, I don't want to take it away from the songbirds, but the typical Juneberry tree is 12 feet tall. And when it's loaded with fruit, there's fruit on the top, and the birds can fly up in the upper branches and eat that fruit, and you can pick from the lower branches and eat that fruit. And there's usually plenty to go around, and you can all have a great time. And by the way, this genus Amelanchier, it does grow wild here in eastern Massachusetts, but it also is one of our native species that's most deployed in parks and other landscapes. So, for example, this photo I took at a place called Paul Revere Park, which is in Charlestown, managed by the DCR, and the DCR planted 24 Juneberry trees, shrubby trees, in that park. And I used to work on Causeway Street in downtown Boston. I would walk across the North Washington Street Bridge on my lunch hour and pick Juneberries and, eat a lot of them myself, but I also propagated plants from these. And this is how I did it. So the seeds inside these fruits are absolutely edible and tasty, but if you have enough patience to do it, first I have to show you the picture of strudel. Yeah, the Juneberries make excellent strudel. Okay, so you spit the seeds out into a plastic bag, you put the bag in the refrigerator, and then you just wait till you sow them. And sometimes what happens with native seeds, most of our native seeds need to go through winter in order to germinate. They need to go through a long period of cold weather, and you can imitate that by putting the seeds in a fridge. But sometimes if the seeds are in the fridge for a long time, the little timers in the seeds go off and they say, okay, it must be spring by now, and they start sprouting. When that happens, you have to sow them right away, otherwise they'll die. And so I've got a whole bunch of Juneberry plants in my nursery. I've grown several dozen. They're now over 3 feet tall Juneberry plants that I grew from seeds I gathered in a public park. It was that easy. All right, wild strawberry. I bet everybody participating in this program tonight has got some place in their property they can plant a wild strawberry, especially if you've got any kind of a mown area like a lawn. Strawberries do well in lawns. They don't mind getting mowed. They don't mind getting stepped on. And they have these flowers which pollinators visit. And then they have these small but delectable fruits, which are great. Now, sometimes when I have extra seed to share, I'll do that. So here's a photo from a girls' school, Miss Hall School out in Pittsfield, where I understood that they had a greenhouse on campus and they were growing some plants. So I gave them some wild strawberry seed. And you can see they took these clamshells, which people are buying fruit in anyway, and they just repurposed them, put the growing medium in there, sprinkled the wild strawberry seed I gave them in there. And I understand they were able to grow plants big enough to sell at the spring plant sale that same spring. All right, dooryard violet, another excellent choice for lawn, doesn't mind getting mowed or stepped on. And the leaves are edible, the flowers are edible. The flowers you could use to decorate other things. You can candy the flowers and use them for decorating other foods. And here's a photo from my lawn where I have a profusion of these dooryard violets. So now, you know how a lot of spring plant sales, like the Lexington Field and Garden Club plant sale, a lot of the plants at that sale will be perennials that people divide and, you know, they have a little bit too much of something. In fact, I see ostrich fern at that spring plant sale, the one in Lexington. That'd be one place to get it. And so it's very easy if you've got a profusion of violets in your yard, like I do, is to pot them up and then give them away. So like all these violets came from my lawn, and you cannot tell that I pulled them out there because it's such a prolific species there that they filled right in. And so where most of these pots went to was to pollinator gardens, because the folks that are interested in planting for pollinators realize this is a nice early season food opportunity for some of their at-risk species they're trying to take care of. And they could care less. These are edible by people. That doesn't bother me. I'm happy to give them the plants. All right, so here is flowering raspberry. So we've accelerated, we've gone into the summer now. And this is a probably the showiest member of the rubus genus, because it has these very pretty magenta colored flowers that are about 2 inches across, these enormous maple-like leaves that are nice to look at. And this plant doesn't have thorns. So this would be worth planting a yard, even if you never ate it. But if you decided to eat it, this would be the main part that you'd eat, the fruit. And I'll be honest with you, I think that red raspberries have a tastier fruit than these do, because these red raspberry fruits are juicier, but these are perfectly edible. They have a nice flavor. So I think they're good. And I'll tell you a quick story about seed. You know, I have very good peripheral vision from decades of foraging, and I can apply that to gathering seed to propagate plants from. So I'm up in a place called Gunstock in Guilford, New Hampshire, that's got a great cross-country ski system. And I saw the mummified remains of some flowering raspberry fruits on a plant next to one of the cross-country ski trails. And I said, I bet I could grow plants from the seed from these fruits. And I did. I brought them to my nursery and I grew plants from them. And I have since then planted some of these out on sites. All right, so here is black raspberry. Now, I don't need to tell you what to do with black raspberry fruit. I'll just point out the very interesting thing the canes are doing right now in the wintertime is they turn this wonderful purple color, which you might like looking at in your own yard. And so if you're out, you know, walking your dog, cross-country skiing on the edge of a field, and you see these purple thorny canes, those are black raspberries. Remember where they are, and then go back and look for the fruit at the end of June, beginning of July. That's when it's ripe. Okay, here's the common elderberry, and some people will gather these flowers and make a beverage from them. There's an alcoholic version, there's a non-alcoholic version. Some people will fry these flowers and fritter better, but I actually think black locust flowers, which will be in my talk with the Field and Garden Club in March, because that's not considered a native species to Massachusetts, so I'm not going to cover it tonight. But black locust flowers make excellent fritters. The other problem with picking the flowers off the common elderberry is you're not going to get any berries there. So I tend to leave the flowers on the plant and wait for the berries to be ripe. And that's what they look like when the berries are ripe. And this photo isn't upside down. That's what the berry clusters do. They hang upside down from the weight of the fruit when they're ripe. And I understand that you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of raw elderberries, but if you dry them first or cook them first, you can eat all you want. Okay, and I have grown elderberries from seed, and there's an example of it. It's a fun thing to do. Here's one of our native wild mints called wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, another plant that the plant for pollinators people really like to plant because the structure of these flowers is such that you really need to be a wild bumblebee with a long tongue or a hummingbird to access the goodies in these flowers. So those are the critters that need our help. And so planting these flowers is a good thing ecologically, but it's also good from a culinary perspective because these leaves and flowers smell and taste just like oregano. So that's how I'd use them as a substitute for oregano. And here is a very pepperminty plant called the broadleaf mountain mint, Pycnanthemum muticum. And this one I would consider better plant for making tea from than the last one I showed you, the wild bergamot, despite the name. This one I offer to you as a suggestion if you'd like to do the insect equivalent of a bird feeder. You'd like to plant something and watch it draw lots of cool insects to your yard. This is what I'd recommend because I see more cool insects on the Pycnanthemum muticum in my nursery than anything else I'm growing. And this is one, the great blue wasp, which is very large and scary looking, but I think it's harmless to people. Okay, here's sweet fern. This is one of the native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. They just steep the leaves in hot water for a few minutes. This plant likes dry, sandy soil. And here's spice bush. The colonists also made tea from these twigs. They just steep those in hot water for a few minutes. The main thing I'm gathering on the spice bush plant, though, to eat are the fruits. And I'll pick them in September when they're ripe, and then I will dry them, and they look like this once they're dry. And then you can store them in your pantry in a little glass jar, and they'll keep for years without going rancid. And then you just grind up a few when you're ready to use them to get a savory spice. And so that milkweed egg puff I showed you earlier, I can use the spice bush berries as a flavoring for that spice. It works really well. However, let me go back a couple slides. Hold on a second. Okay, these red berries are very important to our migrating songbirds because they've got a lot of food value, and the birds will seek these berries out to help fuel the long flights they have to make for their southward migrations. So it's very important if you're gathering spice bush berries in the wild, you leave lots of berries in the plant so the birds get all they need that way. All right, and you can grow spice bush plants from seed, but unlike what you do to eat them, do not let the seeds dry out because if you do, they lose their viability. So I will allow the flesh to rot off the berries, pull that off, and then store these seeds in a plastic bag and then sow them. And another thing that you need to do when you sow things is to think about the ravenous rodents that might dig them up, especially when it's a good size, fleshy seed like a spice bush seed. So I use this protective hardware cloth on most of the flats that I sow in my nursery. And I made the mistake of pulling this one off thinking, oh, the seeds have sprouted and the plants are growing. It's safe to pull the cover off. The next day, this was completely torn apart by the ravenous rodents trying to dig up what remained of the seeds inside the soil. So I encourage you to resist the temptation to pull these off early. You can leave it for an entire growing season and then pull it off the beginning of the next year when the seeds are all used up, and that would be fine. Okay, and another reason why you might want to plant spice bush in your yard is the host plant for this really cool critter called the spice bush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So when this caterpillar egg first hatches, so the early instars of this thing, when this guy's about half an inch long, it looks just like bird poop. So that's an ingenious disguise. That works. Birds don't eat that. And then when the caterpillars get longer, about 1.5 feet, 2 inches long, they develop these fake eye patches. The real eyes are down here. These are fake eyes to make the caterpillar look like a snake. And then even at the pupa stage, the pupa looks just like a dry leaf. So isn't it amazing how this organism has evolved all these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? All right, wintergreen, very common plant in eastern Massachusetts, especially underneath pine trees or hemlock trees, has the wintergreen flavor in the leaves and in the berries. And then, just a complete botanical coincidence, black and yellow birch have the same flavor in the inner bark. So you have to peel the outer bark to get the inner bark flavor. And I had this been a live program, I probably would have made this drink for you. This black birch twig tea, which is exceedingly easy. You just gather, you can do this any day of the year. Gather the twigs, peel them, put the peelings and the peeled twigs in a glass jar full of water, let it sit around for an hour, and then you get a drink which tastes like drinking wintergreen flavored Lifesaver. It's really good. And it's fun to gather birch seeds and sow them. And the best time to do this, so we haven't had a lot of opportunities to do this in Lexington this winter, is right after a snowfall. You can cross-country ski or snowshoe out underneath where the yellow and black birch trees are, and you'll see these little flecks on the surface of the snow. Those are the seeds, and if you sow them, you want to sow them on the surface of your growing medium because they actually need light to germinate. And so I have dozens of birch trees in my nursery that I grew exactly that way. Okay, I'm happy to tell you there's no poisonous species of viburnums. Not all viburnum fruit tastes good, but there are several that do, like this one. The nanny berry has fruit that tastes good. Texture is kind of like a prune. Same thing with this wild raisin fruit. And hobblebush, now this is a plant that I don't think there's any growing wild in Lexington, and I have seen it growing in Eastern Mass, but it really needs a cool, partially shaded habitat. So unless you've got that, I say don't try to grow this one, because this is one of the species I can think of that might be vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It might get too hot for this species here in southern New England. But anyway, it's a gorgeous looking plant, produces these yummy berries. It's a wonderful fall foliage colored plant. So if you got the right spot for it, hobblebush might be worth considering. Okay, hopefully all of you know this is not poison sumac. Poison sumac berries look like this. They look just like poison ivy berries. So any sumac with these tight upright clusters of red berries is not only not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. So this is staghorn sumac in the photo. We also have winged sumac and smooth sumac, and they all have clusters of these tight clusters of red berries. And the main way to eat these is to make a drink from them. And this is explained here in this slide. You gather the fruit when it's ripe, and this would be midsummer onwards. And eventually it will fade in the fall, but beginning of August through September, they should be fine. And just throw them in a bowl full of water and just rub them in the water, and the water will turn this pink or pinkish orange color like that. And then fish the berries out. You're done with them. Take the liquid and put it through any kind of a filter, like a paper towel. And then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. I typically drink it cold and sweetened, like pink lemonade. And there it is. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit off the plant to drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. And all this text is just warning you not to put sumac seeds in your compost unless you want to be picking out sumac plants from your quote unquote finished compost years and years later. I should update that number. It's over 10 by now since I made this mistake. Now for me, it's not that big a deal because I just pot up the sumacs and move them to my nursery, but you might get tired of doing that. Sumac is an underappreciated fall foliage plant. Okay, now this is a plant you're not going to run into in the wild in Lexington, but it would absolutely grow in Lexington where you have sunny conditions and well-draining soil. And you need to plant at least 2 of these if you want them to produce fruit. Now, I show this slide a lot in places where this plant is native and people still don't get it. Then I give them a big hint. Here is a boardwalk going over a dune. Does that help you? And then by then there's usually somebody in the group that says, oh, is that beach plum? And the answer is yes. So for those of you that spend any time like down in the Cape, Vineyard, Plum Island in Essex County, Mass, yes, name for beach plum. If you're wondering, how do I find beach plums? The best time to look for them is in the spring when the plants are blooming, because then they really stand out. Because when the fruit is ripe and the color is usually this purple color, it's a hard color to see at a distance. You really need to know where the plants are before they bloom. And beach plums vary in flavor from bush to bush. Sometimes they're puckery and astringent, and other times they could be really good and just about as good as domesticated plum, except they're small. They're about the size as a cherry, but that's a good size for wild fruit. So I don't mind gathering them at all. And this is a good illustration of beach plums that were growing many, many miles from the ocean. So don't think that it has to grow near the ocean. Thoreau wrote about beach plums occurring many miles from the ocean. Okay, and so I gather them every year. I make beach plum jam every year. And then once you have the jam, you can do other things like make this delicious rugelach from them. So I hope you're able to do that. And yeah, there is an orange fruited variety of beach plums I've also found I'm also growing in my nursery. And beach plum pits, and I save every pit from every beach plum I gather, and I try to grow a plant from it. And so if I store them damp in a plastic bag in my fridge, yes, they can get precocious and sprout early. And so you sow them and get them growing, and then move the flats of plants outside once the weather's nice. So fox grape grows in Lexington, and sometimes the way you find it is you first smell it before you see it. And these are big grapes. These could be as much as an inch in diameter, and they can be really yummy just straight from the vine into your mouth. And so usually I can find this many grapes just from part of the harvest from one vine in one location. So it can be a very prolific plant. And these are great for making things from like this grape cheesecake. Was a delicious way to use it. Here's another species. This also goes in Lexington. This is called the Riverside grape, where the leaves are smooth and green on the underside. And yes, these plants produce grapes too. These grapes are smaller and they're kind of musky flavored. They're not as yummy eating raw as the fox grapes. You could still make jam or jelly from these, but I tend to just use the fox grapes. But some people say that the Riverside grape is the best leaf to use for making stuffed grape leaves. Now, when you gather stuffed grape leaves, it's not when the fruit is ripe, it's months earlier. It's like May or June or maybe early July. And look, the Riverside grapes, once again, are smooth and green on the underside, and these are the ones that you stuff. And it's a really fun thing to serve to company and say, yeah, those are wild grape leaves we picked and stuffed ourselves. So you could do that. So hazelnuts, we've got the American and the beaked hazelnut both growing in this area. And a really fun thing to look for in the spring are the hazelnut flowers, especially the female ones that are really teeny, but this gorgeous ruby color. And they're often very close to the male flowers. So I have gathered many, many hundreds of hazelnuts in Massachusetts. And I'm going to tell you my secrets about how to do it. So first of all, this is the beaked hazelnut, and all this text is just saying, don't let hazelnuts dry out. If you're trying to grow a nut tree from a seed, don't let it dry out or it loses its viability, and protect the flats that you sow these plants in from rodents. It's really critical. I gather hazelnuts under power lines, and I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation. I think it's all the sun they get. Plus, that's a scary place for a squirrel or chipmunk to be because it's exposed and they have to worry about hawks and foxes and owls and snakes and other things that would try to eat them. So they can't work the bushes very well. So I often find lots of hazelnuts there. And the day I gather them is September 8th. And so when I was working, I would find some excuse to be out of the office for half a day and go out and gather hazelnuts. And you also want to pick the hazelnuts when they're ripe, when the husks are beginning to turn brown, but when they're still attached to the plants. If you wait till they hit the ground, you'll never find them. The squirrels and chipmunks will get them before you do. Okay, all oak trees produce acorns, and all acorns are edible. The question is, how bitter are they, and how much work do you have to go to leach out the tannic acid? And in general, the acorns from the soft oak species, the ones with the rounded lobe leaves, have less tannic acid in them than the acorns from the hard oak species, the ones with the pointy lobes. And one challenge with trying to propagate the white oaks acorns is they start to sprout right away soon after they hit the ground. So you can't store them. I made an attempt to store them one year and they all sprouted radicals and they all rotted away. So you need to sow them as soon as you gather them. Here's my number one favorite edible wild plant is the shagbark hickory. I found a lot of these in Middlesex County, although not so much in Lexington, mainly north and west of here. And so there's the pauca hickory, the indigenous preparation that was made from shagbark hickory that's really yummy. And so I gather baskets of these every year. And since it's my number one favorite edible species, I have memorized the location of many, many dozens of trees. And so I just start checking them from mid-September through mid-October. And if a tree is not having a mast year, I just go to my next tree, and I never get skunked anymore because I know where so many are. And so I gather thousands of trees every year, and I eat most of the nuts, which are really yummy. And I wish that I could share them with you tonight, but I can't because we're virtual. So here's a recipe from my book, Maple Hickory Nut Pie, which is like a pecan pie, the New England version of pecan pie. And here's 3 different cookies I make from hickory nuts. So when I did a wild program last week at Tufts, I brought them some of these hickory nut sandwich cookies. And yes, so I save a lot of nuts for propagating into trees, and I use these tall tree pots. Once again, use the hardware cloth in there to prevent the ravenous rodents from digging up my seedlings. And so I'm going to keep going. All right, so here is black walnuts. These definitely grow in Lexington. In fact, one place where you can find a lot of black walnut trees is Willard's Woods. I'll talk about Willard's Woods again in a few minutes. According to town regulations, which I've read very carefully, there's no prohibition on gathering black walnuts on town conservation land. So the time to look for these is first couple weeks October. You do not have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and then they're going to look like that, like old green tennis balls, just piled up along the side of the road or in the park. You can fill up a basket like this. Now you have to get this husk off, which is a messy task. I tend to stomp on it when I find it and get most of it off just right in the field, and then wash the rest off when I get home using water from my rain barrel. And once you've successfully get the gook off the out part, then you've got to crack these open. And these shells are very hard, so I don't recommend trying to use a nut cracker. Probably the device you already have at home that works well on these is a vise. So if you've got a vise in your garage, your tool shed, I'd use that. Here's a device I use that I got from Oklahoma, and this works really well to get the big pieces out. And then black walnuts, I don't think they're as good as shagbark hickory nuts for eating just plain, but they're very good in baked dishes, especially when you're combining them with honey. So here is black walnut baklava, and over here, black walnut honey squares. So this is another preparation I made for the students that they ate last week. All right, and here's a bunch of other trees with edible parts I don't have time to go into tonight, but I'll just share. These are all, they're either native to New England or they can grow here. Like persimmons will grow here now because of climate change. It's one of the few good things to say about climate change is we have more temperate conditions for some of our more southerly edible native species. But tupelo, yes, tupelo is, doesn't need that help. It grows further south, grows further north. And the edible part are the flesh surrounding the seeds in these berries. And the flesh is very sour, but it's great for things like jam. And so I will extract the seeds from the flesh and sow them. And now I have a whole bunch of tupelo plants in my nursery that I grew from wild seeds I gathered. Okay, here is groundnut. This is a species with a lot of importance for food for indigenous people of this region. And the main edible part are these tubers. And so far, my favorite way to use these is to slice them thinly crosswise and fry them in a little vegetable oil and make groundnut chips. They were very good that way. Here's Jerusalem artichoke. So this is a species that's native to the upper Midwest. It's not native to the Northeast. And yet, when the first European explorers to what they call the New World arrived, like the Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain types, they saw Jerusalem artichokes growing all over the place. How can that be? It's because our indigenous tribes of this region traded for it. As we had quahog shells or other things that appealed to the Midwestern tribes, and we got Jerusalem artichoke tubers in return. And it is very likely that patches where these plants are growing wild are patches that were established or descended from patches that were originally planted by Native Americans. So there's the edible part on a Jerusalem artichoke, and these are in the ground right now. So you could harvest them in the ground, but you probably wouldn't want to do it now because the ground is frozen. You want to wait for like March or April when the ground thaws out, then you could dig these up. And so so they're harvestable in the fall, but some people say they're even better if you let them winter over in the ground and then you harvest them in the spring before they start sprouting again. All right, I've got about 10 minutes left and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm just going to talk about what I've been doing with all these native species besides gathering them and eating them and sharing recipes and sharing them with other people. I'm actively propagating and planting them. So after, as Charlie said, after I retired from my day job with the Mass Fish and Game Department, I'm playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species. And I've set up this nursery near where I grew up in Weston, where I've got lots of plants. And then I'm working on arrangements with different groups to plant them in various places on their properties. So here's a list I put together of over 190 species of plants that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people. So this list lives online. If you have any trouble finding it, let me know, and I'm happy to point you to it. So if you want to know what's native and edible, it should be on this list. And then here's my stratification fridge. So this is where I store seed that I've gathered before I sow it. And it looks kind of a mess now. It's a little bit neater now than it was when I took these photos. And Here, most of the sowing I'm doing outside, which is how the Wild Seed Project recommends it. These are all native plants. They haven't evolved to be pampered or coddled. They do want to be protected from being dug up by ravenous rodents, but other than that, you can just do everything outside. And so now, ideally, this happens and you get a great load of snow covering your plants and insulates them. We have not had that winter, and it could be that we don't have winters like that anymore, which is a real shame. So I use leaves. As you saw, I used a layer of leaves to protect my plants from the extra cold. And then some plants that have precocious seed that sprouts earlier, that I just want to get started earlier. I'll do that at my mom's solar room out in Weston. I'll get some plants started early. Here's some shots from what my nursery looks like with a bunch of plants in it. And so here's my mom helping me with some wild lettuce plants. So here's wild lettuce. This plant grows in Lexington. And what you want to look for are the skinny terminal lobes like this that look like a finger, because there is another species of wild lettuce that's bitter. This other wild lettuce isn't poisonous at all, it just tastes bitter. And when I hear wild lettuce, I think about something that I want to eat raw. So look for the wild lettuce with the terminal lobes that are pointy. And then this wild lettuce, this goes to seed. This photo I either took in Lexington or very close by to Lexington. So you gather these seeds and sow them, and then you can get a tray of plants like this, like my mom is holding, because this is a biennial species. So the first year does that, and then the second year. But when the plant is small, it's very tasty. You don't need to read through this list. This is just an example of some of the sites where I've done some planting. Here's one site. This is Crown and Shield Island, otherwise known as Brown Island, off the coast of Marblehead, owned by the trustees of reservations, a place I've led many wild edibles walks on over the years. And one year I went out there and I saw all this great habitat for beach plums, but no beach plums out there. So I asked the trustees, could I go out and plant some beach plums there? And they said, sure. So I identified some good sites in the island to plant some plants, walked around, found some spots, dug some holes, organized some volunteers, and we took the plants across the mudflat. This island is accessible by walking at low tide. And then we planted the plants in the holes I had dug. And now I would be misleading if I told you every single plant we put in is thriving. I made a couple rookie mistakes while we planted these. Like a couple of the plants I planted a little bit too close to the salt water. I think they just got too salty for their own good. But some of them, at least 6 of them, are thriving and producing fruit. So that's really great. Now there's beach plums out on this island. Here's another island not far away called Baker's Island. This is in Salem waters, and 10 acres of this island is owned by the Essex National Heritage Area, where they have a lighthouse and a keeper's cottage you can stay in. And I lead wild edible walks there every year, except for last year when we got rained out. But I have diversified what was out there naturally with a whole bunch of additional native edible species that are doing really well out there, I'm happy to say. I have contributed native edible species to paddler access campsites along the Connecticut River. So here's one in Whately, Mass. Here's one in Montague, Mass, where I planted some plants. The Housatonic River has this wonderful spot called Riverwalk that is in downtown Great Barrington, 1 block from all the hustle and bustle of all the shops and everything. Just park your car. If you're in town, you have an extra half an hour, look for the drugstore and you'll see the kiosk for Riverwalk, and just start walking down. And in just a short distance, you're in this gorgeous habitat that's all fixed up from what used to be a complete eyesore with the rubble, the rebar, and the cinder blocks just heaved over the side, and Japanese knotweed growing everywhere. They cleaned all that up. They brought in good soil. They put in all these native plants like ostrich ferns that you see here, and the plants are doing really well. So here's another site I contributed plants to. This is marsh marigold to stream in Acushnet, Mass. So this project you should know, Willard's Woods. As you may know, there was a culvert draining the former pond in Willard's Woods that collapsed, and they needed to deal with that pipe. Instead of replacing it, they just decided to daylight the flow out of that former pond, now wetland. And Jordan McCarran, who was the conservation agent at the time, knew what I was doing, and he said, Russ, what native edible species would you recommend for replanting in this site once we plant it up after the construction equipment is all gone? And I gave him a list, and he went to his contractor, who went to his supplier and said, you got any of these plants? And they were able to source some plants. And then for the plants they couldn't source, I provided them for my nursery, and we put them in. So here's a planting plan that I drew up. Here we are, some volunteers from the town, staff from the consultant, Jordan, putting the plants in. And now, not every plant we put in is thriving, but a bunch of them are. And here's an example of the flowering raspberry that we planted along the daylighted stream that's really happy. And when I see a plant like this, I feel like I can read this plant's mind. And the plant is sending me this message. And the message is, Russ, thank you so much for planting me here. I'm really happy here. All right, here's the site up in Maine, the headquarters for the Maine Audubon Society. I brought a bunch of plants up to them, including this one, spikenard, which is a wonderful plant that I also think is a great pollinator magnet, like shade, like stamp shade. So if you got that, this is worth considering. And here's a permaculture site up in the White Mountains, New Hampshire, called D Acres. That's the single best site for wild edibles I know of anywhere. So I recommend going there. I brought a bunch of plants up there from my nursery to plant them, and they're doing really well. And okay, here's one of my more recent sites. So this is the Miyawaki Forest that went into Danahy Park in Cambridge. The former landfill behind the Whole Foods, that Fresh Pond Shopping Center, is where Danahy Park is. And so I found out about this project and said, well, I've got plants. Why don't I bring them in? So I brought a whole bunch of plants to this site, which went in, and I helped plant them. And there's a view of it from the air. So this is right after they went in. These plants are much bigger now. This is looking very lush. And this project's been featured in the New York Times, and I'm happy to say that it's the first of what are turning out to be many in the Boston area. There's ones in Natick now, and Brookline. There's one going in. There's one in Ayer, Mass. There's one going in Groveland, Mass. Or is it Georgetown? Anyway, it's up there in the North Shore later on this year. Okay, and when I have extra seed, I'm happy to share it. So here's an organization called Wild Ones, which is kind of like the national version of Lexington Living Landscapes. So there's a national organization with chapters, and there is a chapter on the South Shore that I belong to, and they have a seed swap, and so I'll bring seeds from my nursery and share them. Okay, and here is an indigenous group I've been working with. This is the Mass Center for Native American Awareness, and I have led a walk for them at Greenbelt's Cox Reservation. So Greenbelt is the land trust that published my Wild Edibles book, and they allow foraging as a permitted activity on all their properties that are open to the public, which is, public means indigenous people too. So we had this event just for this indigenous group to come to Greenbelt's property and say, hey, here are edible wild plants here. You can come back and forage here. It's totally okay. And that walk really went well. So we're going to do it again this year. All right, almost done. So here are two books I recommend if you want to, get a book and sit in an armchair and really have this stuff soak in. This book is great if you want to know what edible species that are edible by people, which specific insects and birds they benefit. This book is really good for that. And then here's a book that came out recently that does an excellent job of explaining why not just people in their backyards, but everybody, towns, land trusts should be reestablishing edible, native, and medicinal plant communities on their properties. So wonderful resource. And with that, I am finally done. Thank you so much for listening to me. I apologize for speaking so fast, but as you see, I had a lot of ground to cover. And so here's this book that I kept mentioning, and it is available. Probably the best place to get it, if you're really itching to get your hands on one right away, is through the Mass Association of Conservation Commissions in Belmont. You should go to maccweb.org and go to their store, and you can order one from them there. But if you can wait about a month and a half, the next version of the book is going to have a very long letter from me to Indigenous people thanking them. And so I think if you can wait, it would be good to get the book then. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, grab my URL, grab my my email address here, because I'm about to turn it off so that we can go through the questions.
Thanks, Russ.
Yep.
If you are able to stop sharing it, then might
Yeah.
be easy to see your face.
Yeah, I'm just trying to
Okay.
get the thing open here. Hold on just a second.
No worries.
Okay. Okay. All right. See, I hid my toolbar and now I can't find it again. So hold on. Let me at least close that out. Close that out. Okay. And I will find it again. All right. So let me go to, okay. All right. Well, can you read the Q&A while I'm doing this?
Absolutely.
Okay. Feel
So
free to
first
do that.
off, thank you for sharing so much about so many different edible plants in such a short time. And I imagine a number of other people are feeling a little bit like, wow, I tried to absorb it all and I couldn't. So I just want to first remind everyone that we are recording this event, and we are going to, you'll receive, if you registered, you're going to receive an email from Matt from Cary Library at the end with a link to the recording in the next couple days. And I think we'd like to make sure that we put, oh, thanks, Russ.
Sure.
I think we'll make sure we put a link to your list of edible native plants. That was great. We can make sure that we get that link from you before we send that out as well.
Yeah, I have an even better link to share with you, because in the year 2000, right before the pandemic, I gave a live program to the Ecological Landscape Alliance where I provided a resource page which has a link to that list and lots of other very useful information for anybody that wants to plant or propagate native edible plants. So I'll send you the link to that resource page, and that will have lots and lots of good stuff in it.
Fantastic. And then we'll make sure that everyone who is watching tonight or who registered and is going to watch later receives that by email, and we'll put it up on our website with the resources. So thank you.
Sure.
So people have asked a bunch of really great specific questions, and I just wanted to ask a more general question first, which is, I mean, you've been doing this for decades, so you have a lot of expertise about distinguishing between plants that you know are edible and ones that maybe look similar. I was thinking specifically about the wild leek leaves look a little bit like some other lily-like leaves that come up that are not those. And so other than buying the plants and planting them in our yards as a great way to get familiar with them, what other ways do you suggest that people develop that expertise slowly?
So, well, one way is to go on my walk that I'm leading at Lincoln Woods. That would be a great way to learn at least the plants we're going to encounter on that walk. And I, you know, as my last slide there, I had a link to my schedule of all the other programs I do. So it's not just Lexington. You know, I'll be doing a walk in Waltham and a walk, you know, other walks locally, as well as all over New England and Eastern New York State. I do about 40 programs a year. So folks should be able to track me down somewhere. And my book isn't really an excellent field guide. It's more, you know, peppered with interesting stories about the plants and recipes and stuff like that. But for a field guide, I'd probably recommend Sam Thayer's books. He is above, you know, head and shoulders above any other wild edible plant author I know of in terms of popularity amongst the foraging people, in terms of his having great descriptions, great color photos and stuff like that. And his website is foragersharvest.com. So I'd go there. And I have heard there are foraging apps out there, and I got asked to help work on one. I decided not to, because I would rather just be outside with people and not so much, you know, like doing the high-tech things. Although I understand that, you know, apps are useful. I mean, people use apps to identify birds and stuff when they're out there, you know, and I would just like to draw a distinction between like a bird app like Merlin, where you're just trying to figure out what a bird is, and foraging app where you're actually going to put something in your mouth. the consequences of making a mistake are potentially a little bit greater. And so, so I probably would not rely solely on an app to know what I have. I'd probably, look for at least two different sources. But also remember, though, that a lot of plants that are out there are plants that people already know, like dandelions, for example. They're not my show tonight because dandelions aren't considered a native species by most ecologists. But anyway, and daisies, and there's a bunch of things, so for plants that you already know, maybe you want to come to my talk at the Lexington Field and Garden Club where I talk about edible weeds and invasives for plants that are also in your yard that you might be familiar with. And let me just say, in terms of plants, this is not true for mushrooms, but for plants, the vast majority of poisonous plants that grow around here taste horrible. So my advice is don't eat plants that taste bad. It doesn't mean that every edible native species or any edible plant, non-native species, is going to be delicious straight from the bush of the vine, whatever, but a lot of them require some kind of advanced preparation. But if you think you've identified the right thing and you bring it home and you prepare it according to instructions, you got a big steaming plate of it in front of you and you take a bite and it doesn't taste good, I would suggest not overriding that danger signal your taste buds might be giving you. You might have made a mistake in identification. So last thing I'll say on this subject is I don't know of any berry that grows around here that tastes delicious and is poisonous. So if you take a test bite of a berry and it tastes good, you're safe.
Thanks for that,
sure.
guidance. But all the resources you shared sound really, really helpful. So thank you for that. I'm going to go to some of the questions that people have been writing in because they're really great ones. One was, what are your thoughts or experience on harvesting near roads and traffic? I've heard plants should be like 100 feet from the nearest road to be safe and not highly polluted, but many homes and backyards don't have that much clearance.
Right. Yeah. So I worry about this, but not a lot, because even as much foraging as I do, it's at the very most 10% of my diet, and 90% of my diet comes from conventional sources like my backyard, the food I grow in my backyard, or farm stands and supermarkets, stuff like that. And so unless you're going to a contaminated area and you're gathering meal after meal after meal there over a prolonged period of time, I don't think your exposure to heavy metals and stuff like that is that great from that kind of a place. So, but ideally you'd like to harvest from, spots away from heavily traveled roadways, away from places where everybody takes their dog for a walk. Although if something grows above a certain height, even a Great Dane can't reach it, and I don't worry that much about it. So there's no magic formula about this. Just use your common sense. If you're like hiking in the woods, you see a nice berry patch, you see a bunch of building debris dump right next to the berry patch, probably not a good idea to eat the berries from that patch. So yeah, just keep your wits about you and don't override, potential, misgivings you might have about a spot, and you should be fine.
Thanks. Someone else wrote that last year there was a lot of the apple cedar rust on service berries due to the wet.
Yeah.
Does that affect the berries' edibility?
Oh yeah. They're nasty looking and tasting, and yeah, you don't want to eat them if they have the cedar rust, but it'll be really obvious because the fruit looks disgusting when they're on there. No, the problem last year was how wet it was. It was just wet. And so it was really easy for the fungus to spread. So, but I mean, you saw that photo of those June berries in my slideshow, those gorgeous, perfect berries with not any rust on any of them. So they do exist in Eastern Massachusetts. So keep your eyes peeled. First day of summer, start looking for them, and good luck. I think you should be able to find some.
Another question was, how far will a squirrel go to bury a shagbark hickory nut? I found 3 in my yard last fall, but I don't know where to look for the tree.
Yeah. I don't know this for sure, and I can only speak anecdotally what I've seen, but I've certainly seen, little hickory sprouts growing hundreds of yards away from the mother tree. So it's amazing that the squirrels have the ability to not just stop and eat that nut and keep it in their mouths and plant it. And boy, am I grateful for forgetful squirrels and chipmunks. That's how we have a lot of our nut trees out there, is because of that. And once we're on the subject, let me just bring up something, an observation that I made in my nursery. Is these ravenous rodents are trying to get at the nuts I've sown in my nursery, my pots that I'm trying to grow into trees to plant out in the landscape. And what I say to myself is, if these squirrels and chipmunks only knew what I was doing and propagating these trees and planting them out, and how their progeny would benefit so much from having these trees out there. But no, they're thinking short term, and we humans, we can relate to that because we often think short term too.
Indeed. Well, on the topic of propagation, someone else was asking if you've ever tried the jug method, which I think maybe they're thinking about the now popular winter sow method with
Yes.
water.
Yes, yeah, I have done that, and when I'm paying attention to it and not just to totally neglect them, I've gotten very good results with them. So, like the Monarda fistulosa that I showed, the wild bergamot, that grows really well using the winter sow method, and I've grown lots of other things too. I've grown like a species that I don't know anybody else growing, called seaside plantain or goose tongue. It's a cousin of our plantain, the gardenweed plantain, but it's a native species growing right along the coastline, and it's delicious. And I've gathered the seed and propagated that in a milk jug. So yeah, I've grown New Jersey tea in a milk jug. So yeah, I've definitely used that technique. But once again, I say you have to keep your eye on the jugs, because if you don't, take the tape off and open them up when spring comes, the little plants get fried inside, or other bad things can happen. So yeah, don't get neglectful like I did.
What parts of the plantain are you eating? The leaves?
The leaves, and the common plantain's edible too. The dooryard weed, Plantago major, and that will be my show at the Lexington Field and Garden Club.
One question I was wondering about, since you, I think, thankfully organized this phenologically, was are you seeing the seasonal availability?
Good question. Yes. One of my tough students asked me that last week, and I was proud of him for asking that. And the answer is yes, not in a major way. And, I'm not very scientific about what I do, but I will say anecdotally, I have seen the seasons creep earlier about a week or a week and a half for some things. Like I used to say for the elderberry fruits, gather them the first week of September, and now I see them ripe the last week of August. Same thing with black cherry. I used to say early September for those. Now it's the last week of August. So now for us, for humans, we're pretty, adaptable and resilient. We can just say, okay, I got to go out a week earlier. But, for wild creatures that have needs like migration and stuff, it could be a problem if the seasons start, the timing gets off for them. But, for us, you just adapt with the conditions.
Another thing that seems to be changing more as we lose a lot of these long cold periods in winter is that a lot of things are sort of buds are opening, especially for flowers early, and then maybe not surviving. I'm seeing that a lot on maybe non-native species. Are you seeing that with any of the native species? Are they getting affected where we'll have the buds die off and then don't go to the flower?
Okay. So it is definitely true that the more erratic weather we've been having as a symptom of climate change has been a problem. Like in my nursery, for example, last year when we had that extra cold weekend in February, I lost a bunch of plants that, were sitting in pots on the ground, and the roots got frostbite and they just didn't make it. So the way I hedged for that this year is I did several different things. One thing is I moved some plants into my mom's unheated garage, so they would never get extra cold being outside. And then for some of the plants that were still in pots outside, I dug holes for them. I used this technique, which is called the pot in pot technique, where you dig a hole, you put a pot in that hole, and then you put the pot with a plant in it in the pot in the ground, and the ground insulates the plant. And I'm pretty confident that the plants I did that for will be fine no matter how cold it gets this winter.
Thanks. Like a new era where we have to try to figure out that puzzle.
Yep.
See. Have you heard of the not-for-profit group called Mill City Grows in Lowell? They're establishing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So there is this exciting project which is under development right now, where Mass Audubon um, and the Lowell Parks and Conservation Trust and Mill City Grows and maybe one or two other partners are coming together and taking an old Christmas tree farm, and they're turning it into habitat. And I think they're going to have some agriculture happening on that property too. And it's a wonderful project, and I have already indicated my interest in helping them out with further diversifying that site with additional native edible species that they could grow on the edge of the pathways and stuff like that once it's time to do the planting there.
Seems like every time someone has an inclination, they're going to find you, Russ, and that's so great because it's wonderful how willing you are to share everything you've been learning with all of us. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's much more fun to share this stuff than to hoard it all myself.
Oh, I'll ask, there's someone asked a follow-up question about the pot in pot method.
Right.
So they're asking, are you concerned about the plants growing roots into the ground and then damaging the roots when you remove the inner pot in the spring?
Well, it depends on how long you leave it in that suggestion. I think over one winter, it's fine. But if you leave it for multiple years in that situation, sure, that plant is likely to grow roots that are going to go through the pot it's planted in into the next pot and probably into the ground below that. And yeah, pulling that plant out could be a little traumatic for the plant. So one thing you can do is in the pot you put in the ground, you can put in a couple inches worth of wood chips or something like that, that will act as a kind of an informal barrier to the roots from the above ground plant. So even if they do go through the bottom of the top pot, they're just going into those wood chips, and it's still be pretty easy to pull it out.
That's a really helpful suggestion. Thank you.
Sure.
I think people have some more questions, but you've shared your email. I think I'm gonna say thank you so much, Russ, for sharing so much information. I know I have a bunch of things I want to read up on after this, and I'll probably rewatch portions of your talk to reabsorb what you shared with us tonight. But I'd like to pass back to Matt from Cary Library, and thanks to Cary Library for hosting our entire presentation tonight. This has been really very exciting talk. I'm excited to think about outside in my yard and what I can plant a little bit differently thanks to your talk.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much, Russ.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Just wanted to reiterate that this program is recorded and will be on the Cary Library YouTube channel, and we'll send out a recap after this program in the next coming days with Russ's email and the link to the video and some other information. But thank you so much, Russ, for sharing all this knowledge with us, and thank you.
It's my
Sarah
favorite subject.
Yeah. And thank you, Sarah and Charlie, for putting this together. Have a good evening, everyone.